Good afternoon, and welcome to another in our series of Comparative Religions classes. The last couple of weeks we've been looking at the traditions of Islam. We had an introduction to it 2 weeks ago into the general overall how the tradition of Islam began with Muhammad. Last week we looked at the largest group within Islam, the people who are known as the Sunnis, and all of their origins and their traditions and their beliefs and practices. Today we're going to be looking at the second group of the Islamic tradition, which is the Shiite tradition. And these are the smaller group within Islam. Their beliefs and practices are a little bit different than what we find in the Sunni traditions, and their history is a little bit more involved. So without any further comments, we're going to get on with this. The traditions of Shiite Islam. The group of people who are known as the Shiites form the second major branch of Islam. They make up approximately 10 to 15% of all Muslims in the world. And primarily, the Shiite tradition is found in Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, India, and Pakistan. It's a smaller group than the Sunnis, but one group that has had a significant impact in the world, particularly in recent years. Shia is a short form of the historic phrase Shi'atu Ali, meaning the followers or the party of Ali ibn Abi Talib. He was the cousin and the son-in-law of Muhammad. And the Shia believe that Ali is the only legitimate successor of Muhammad in the caliphate. The caliphate, as you may remember, is the understanding of the leader that oversees all of the political and religious life of the Islamic people. And they believe that Ali is the only one who is the legitimate heir to Muhammad in the carrying on the traditions of Islam. Now, what happens is very disruptive in the entire history of Islam. The Shia consider Ali to have been divinely appointed as the successor to Muhammad and as the first imam. Certain individuals among Muhammad's descendants are known as imams, and it is believed in the Shia tradition that these people possess very special spiritual and political authority over the community. They are believed to be infallible, and they have other quasi-defined traits attributed to them. They become very important in the early years of the tradition, and continuing on through their authority continues to speak to the Shiite tradition to these days. Muhammad died in 632 in the Common Era. And as we mentioned last week as we were looking at the Sunnis, Muhammad never really directly appointed anyone to follow after him in leadership. And that caused the greatest amount of problems in the early years. When Muhammad died, Ali and his closest relatives made all of the funeral arrangements. While they were doing that and preparing the body according to the traditions, Sunni leaders from Medina elected a man by the name of Abu Bakr as the caliph. And this started a long series of problems. Abu Bakr appointed his successor, a man by the name of Umar, and when Abu Bakr died in 634, 2 years after the time that Muhammad had died, Umar took over as the religious and political leader of the entire Islamic tradition. When he died in 644, a man by the name of Uthman became the third caliph. And here's where we start having the real split between the Sunni and the Shiite. Uthman was murdered in the year 657. And the Muslims at this time were so desperate to pull things together that they invited Ali to become the fourth caliph. And he willingly accepted that role at that time. Ali's rule over the early community, however, was often contested. The followers of Ali, the party of Ali, the Shiite, wanted him to stay, and other members who were a part of the Sunni population didn't want him. They wanted somebody else to be the leader, and there was a constant struggle over who was going to be the legitimate heir and the legitimate leader of this tradition that was started by Muhammad. The political infighting began very seriously at this point in time. Ali's caliphate led to the first Islamic civil war. The fighting and the arguing became so intense that they literally turned to physically fighting in a civil war over who was going to be the leader of this tradition. Ali was assassinated in the year 661. So we've got this struggle going on for trying to figure out what's going to happen next. The various aspects of Islam are fighting with each other, and we're beginning to see more of this struggle taking place. Upon the death of Ali, his eldest son, a man by the name of Hassan, became the leaders of the Muslim community. Now, after a series of skirmishes between these rival factions, the Sunni and the Shia, Hassan agreed to give up his role to try and maintain peace among the Islamic community. He wanted everybody to really basically learn how to get along and to solve the problems that were going on. He decides it's best for him to step down as the leader and let someone else take over. He has a relative. This is a very interesting story. Hussein, who is Ali's younger son and brother to Hassan, initially resisted the call to lead the Muslims and to reclaim the caliphate. There was a groundswell of support for Hussein to take this position as the caliph and as an imam, and so Hussein collected his family together and his followers in the city of Medina, and they set off for the town of Kufa. And when he got to Kufa, that was his understanding that he was going to accept the role as the caliph and imam. So he has all of his family with him, he has all of his supporters with him, and we run into a really serious problem when Hussein and 72 members of his family and his followers were killed by the Sunni opposition. This took place in the town of Karbala. This is in modern-day Iraq. This is where this episode takes place, and basically the killing of Hussein and his family members was the definitive break between the Shiites and Sunni. Never again will these two groups be together. They are going in their own separate ways, their own separate understandings of the tradition of Muhammad. The Shia regard Hussein as a martyr. He becomes a major figure in their history and in their beliefs and practices, and they still honor him as a, quasi-divine type of person, somebody who had a great deal of influence, one of the early imams of the tradition, one of the followers of the teaching of Muhammad. He is lifted up to a high position, particularly now as a martyr. They saw him primarily as a defender of the entire faith of Islam, and for him to be killed is just a tragedy that they cannot get beyond. They held the Sunni completely responsible for his death. Now, what happens here becomes very important in the self-understanding of the Shiite community. Hussein becomes a symbol. He's not just a martyr. He's not just a hero. He is not just one of the imams. He's not just one of the leaders. He is somebody who sets an understanding of what it means to be a part of the Shiite community. Hussein comes to symbolize resistance to any and all forms of tyranny. Their understanding is they have to stand up for and defend anybody who is oppressed, anybody who is threatened by tyranny. This becomes a major part of the understanding of Shiite Islam. It will play a role in our modern world, as we will see in just a little while. Hussein becomes this kind of hero and this kind of symbol for the entire Shiite community. Every year, on the day of Ashura, Hussein is commemorated. They remember the day that he died. They remember that he was a martyr. And they remember that he was the one who was there to defend, to protect, to care for anyone who is oppressed. This grows out of an understanding of the major principles of Islam. We'll look at these again shortly, but one of the principles of the Islamic tradition is the understanding of charity. Muhammad in his own life was somebody who had seen the death of many of his family members. He had seen many of his people in the Saudi peninsula that had been oppressed, had been faced with all kinds of horrible situations, and he realized that he had an obligation to care for and protect other people. Charity becomes one of the major points of Islam. The understanding that no matter what is going on in your life, you have an obligation to care for anyone who is worse off than you are. So as a part of the understanding of charity and this understanding that Hussein is somebody who stands up against any kind of oppression, this becomes a major mark of Shiite tradition. Now, with all Muslims, the Shiite do follow the teachings of the Quran. They also model the life of Muhammad as it has been preserved in the Hadiths, the writings of the followers of Muhammad in the centuries after his life, telling the stories of how he lived, things that he did, the way that he acted, the stories that he told. These Hadiths have been saved and passed on. And so they hold on to those teachings as well. The Shiite also cite what is known as the Way of Eloquence. This was a collection of writings. They were letters, sermons, and sayings that were attributed to Ali while he was the caliph. They hold on to these collected writings as other ways of understanding how you're supposed to live your life as a Shiite. Now, veneration for Ali and Hussein is a distinction of the Shiite tradition. You don't find this veneration of other people other than Muhammad in the aspects, the beliefs, the traditions, the practices of Sunni Islam. But in Shiite Islam, the veneration for Ali and for Hussein is very, very prominent. Later historical figures also deserve to be included under the category of founders of this tradition, and they get lifted up as people to emulate, to follow, and to understand that they are examples that are set for all to be aware of. Now, what happens here is the contributions of legal scholars and theologians turn the Shia tradition into something a little bit different from Sunnism. Their understanding and their interpretation of the Quran and their interpretation of the Hadiths and the writings attributed to Ali and this distinction of all of these historical figures put together an interpretation that is completely different from the Sunni traditions. And what we're seeing here now is this is beginning to pull together, is the Sunni and the Shiite are growing further and further apart as time goes along. Now, a key development was the idea of the imam, a line of superior religious leaders. These were men who had been a part of the inner core of followers of Muhammad in the early days. They are people who were recognized to be very pious, very dedicated, very devout believers, and they were lifted up as superior religious leaders. They became the spiritual and political successors of Muhammad. The imams are human individuals who are called to rule over the community with justice. And that is something that has to play out in both the public and the private lives, in the religious life and the political life. It is all a part of the role that they form, and this is something that continues to this day. They were also the ones who were to keep and obey and follow, but then interpret the divine laws as found in the Quran. They become the prominent religious leaders. The words and deeds of Muhammad and the words and the deeds of the imams are guides and models for everyone to follow. Now here's the thing. These imams are understood to be infallible. They have to be free from any error and free from any sin, and they must be chosen by a divine decree. And they had an understanding that there is always in existence what is called the Imam of the age. This is a person who has been divinely appointed in every day, every age, every era, all throughout history. There is one who is the Imam of the age, who is appointed by God, that has the authority over all matters of faith and law in the Muslim community. This person has a very prominent and very powerful role in society. Ali was considered to be the first imam. And he was the rightful, according to the Shiite tradition, he is the rightful successor to Muhammad, and followed by male descendants of Muhammad through Muhammad's daughter Fatima. Any male that comes from the tradition of Muhammad through his daughter Fatima is one who is able to become an imam. Ali was the first, and the establishment of a formal designation of successors granted the Shia continuity over time. We know that if Ali is an imam, then one of his descendants has to be the one who follows him after he dies, and so on down the line. There's a continual connection through birth and family and relationship, always connected back to Muhammad, of the role of these imams. And this becomes known as what is called in the Shiite tradition, Twelver Islam. And we'll see why here as we go forward. The focus on knowledge and the imams as religious authorities made them independent of political success. No matter what happened, these imams always had the role of religious authority. It allowed them to maintain their position as politically neutral, although their words and their teachings and their emphasis controlled both the public and private life of people, both the religious and the political lives, but they remained politically neutral so they could become religious leaders. A crucial event took place in the the death of the man who was the 11th Imam, Hassan al-Askari. This happened in 874. When he dies, the period following his death is referred to as a time of perplexity. He is the 11th Imam in order, all related back through parentage, all the way back to Muhammad, and of course to Ali, the first Imam. But he dies, and we have a problem. No suitable follower had been identified. He had not chosen somebody to pick up the reins after his death. And so what do we do at this point in time? Claims arose that al-Askari had a child by the name of Muhammad. Now, the belief in the Shiite tradition is that Muhammad, this child of al-Askari, went into what they call the occultation. This was a realm outside of the existence of the world as you and I know it. It is removed from what you and I can see. It's a place that is out there. It's not heaven, but it certainly is not earth. This occultation was considered to be a safe sphere removed from this metaphysical world. And this is where we get the role of the 12th Imam, or Twelver Islam. This Muhammad, the child, is a messianic figure. And it is believed that he is completely and totally infallible. He was born, but after he was born, he disappeared. And one day, this 12th Imam, this Muhammad al-Mahdi, is going to return and fill all of the world with justice. He becomes a messianic figure looking forward to what is going to become known as the Day of Judgment. 4 close associates of al-Askari became the mediators, and they are known as Safir. They became the mediators between al-Mahdi and his followers. Muhammad al-Mahdi, well, he's in this other place, this other realm outside of the world in which you and I are in. He is in another realm outside of heaven. But 4 close associates of his father al-Askari become the mediators between him and the people. The tradition of Shiite Islam is that this occultation continues on to this present day. So far, this messianic figure of Muhammad has not returned, and they still wait for that day to happen. When the last of the 4 Safirs died, the 12th Imam had decided not to appoint another deputy. And so, in the words of the tradition, Muhammad says, "Henceforth no one will see me unless and until Allah makes me appear. My reappearance will take place after a very long time." This occultation still continues to go on to this very day, and the Shiites continue to wait for the return of this 12th Imam. And that is the day when everything in heaven and in earth is going to be made right. He continues to be this messianic figure in the tradition of Islam. The 12th Imam is considered to be the only legitimate and just ruler. And so, since this time of the 12th Imam, there has been no political action taken in his absence that can be seen as fruitful. The idea here is that in his absence, the people of the Shiite tradition are to focus on their faith, their practice, their following of the divine commands in the Quran, and to prepare for the coming of this Imam back into the world again. And what has happened here is because the focus has been on the religious traditions and religious devotion and the pietistic observances of all of their religious beliefs, the Shia clerics have been able to survive even in a hostile environment. They have been a minority within Islam. There still is the animosity and fighting between the Sunnis and the Shia. And what happens here is this position of understanding that they cannot take political action allows them to exist no matter what the situation is like. If the Sunnis control all of the political power in the world, that's fine. They can hold on to their religious traditions and wait with expectation. The religious authority of the Shia clerics is derived solely from their role as deputies of the absent 12th Imam. They are to hold on to the traditions of the Twelver Islam until this messianic figure returns. And as such, they have an advantage. Because they are the religious leaders in the Islamic countries, there is a religious tax that is paid. And because they are the ruling religious deputies, they receive the religious tax. And it becomes a source of substantial economic autonomy for these leaders. So they have a very good, powerful position in society as religious leaders while not holding on to any political power, and they are the ones who are able to survive very well no matter what the situation is. Shia clerics are often referred to as mullahs. You'll hear that term that is used quite frequently. The most prominent clerical position was the one that was known as the Marja al-Taqlid. It means to be sought to imitate. The idea of these religious leaders, these mullahs, is to be prominent people that you want to follow in their ways. You want to imitate them, and the most prominent clerical position is the one who is called the source to imitate. That's who you want to follow as the example for living. The Shia clergy, however, does not have any formal hierarchy. All of these mullahs, all of these imams that are now in existence are all of the same level of position and authority, and there isn't any kind of a hierarchy that you will find in other traditions. There's another contemporary term that has come into play in our world over the last 30, 40 years, and is the term of Ayat Allah, or as we pronounce it, Ayatollah, the Arab word that means a sign of God. The Ayatollah it's a title, it's a modern one, but it really does not have any kind of established religious function. But it's a name that we have become familiar with in our world over the past 30 years, and we'll see how some of that plays out here now because of the changes that have begun to take place in Shiite Islam in the modern world. In Iran, the adoption of the Shia state religion led to the expansion of clerical involvement in public life, and particularly, as we will see, in the role of the Ayatollah. The threat of European colonialism in the 19th century presented the opportunity for Shia activists to gain a foothold in their society. As the European countries in the 19th century began taking over all parts of the Middle East, and the influence of England and France and other countries in this area at this time really began to give the Shia activists a little bit more of a power in their society as they were trying to hold on to their traditional beliefs threatened by European understandings that are being brought into the region at this time. The attempt of the Pahlavi family, that was the Shah. Remember the Shah of Iran? He was the monarch. That family was the monarchy that was ruling throughout the 20th century. They set out to try and curtail the influence of the clerics. Many of the clerics in the 20th century, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I and continuing through the time period of World War II and up into the 1950s and 1960s, many of the clerics of the Shia tradition were forced to flee, and yet trying to curtail the influence of these clerics actually created in them a clerical political militancy. And benefiting from a strong clerical network and enjoying a credibility untouched by corruption, one of these leaders that had to flee the country was known as Ruhollah Khomeini. The Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini brought Shia activism into the mainstream of Iranian life. And when the revolution came in 1979, the Shia activists stressed the non-sectarian, pan-Islamic character of its ideology. What they were saying is that they have the way to show Islam into the current and future world. They didn't want to have this sectarianism. They wanted this to be something that stretched across all of Islam in the world. Islam, in this understanding of the Shiite tradition, Islam should be lived as a tool for the empowerment of the oppressed and not merely as a set of devotional practices. Remember, this understanding of caring for the oppressed, caring for those who are under tyranny, is a basic bedrock foundational understanding of this tradition. It goes back to their earliest days in the split from Sunni Islam. The empowerment of the oppressed is what becomes a major focus. And it's not just devotional practices anymore. Since that time, the Shiite community, particularly starting in Iran but around the rest of the world, have supported the Palestinians in their fight for freedom. They have supported the people of Afghanistan in order to help them find their freedom. And they have done the same in the country of Lebanon, to allow this sense of caring for the oppressed and fighting against tyranny to take over and control what's happening in other regions of the world. Organizations like the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Hezbollah, and the Islamic Jihad were or are supported by the Iranians because they see these organizations as fighting against oppression and tyranny. And so they give their support to them completely. Now, underneath this tradition that's existing in the world today, the walaya, or known as guardians, they give authority or guardianship to a person, community, or a country. And this becomes very good. It is used to denote one who is vested with the authority of God. And this person tends to be genealogical descendants of Muhammad, and his spiritual heirs, the imams, are the ones who become the guardians in a particular community. Tahara, or purity, is focused on the observation of cleanliness in the soul, cleanliness in your clothing, cleanliness in everything that goes on in life. Purity is very important, and this is obligatory upon all Muslims. Before prayers, before eating, before touching the Quran, you have to wash your hands. You cannot pray and you cannot read the Quran with dirty hands. You cannot eat food without washing your hands. Purity is an observation that has to be done all the time. Muhammad is reported to have said, and this is a part of the Shiite beliefs and traditions, Muhammad is reported to have said that the angels of mercy will turn away from a person whose mouth emits a foul smell because of unclean teeth. It is that simple. This purity, this personal hygiene is a part of the obligation of living your life all of the time. Cleanliness is next to godliness. We've all heard that growing up. It's a very simple understanding. They do hold to the traditions of prayer 5 times a day, the fasting that occurs during the month of Ramadan. I mentioned before the understanding of charity and how important that is, that you have an obligation to care for other people. The Hajj, making the pilgrimage to Mecca, is an obligation for every able-bodied Muslim. No matter where you live in the world, at least once in your lifetime, you have to make the pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. And another thing that plays a prominent role in Shiite belief is the understanding of jihad or struggle. They're going to differ in their understanding of jihad from how the Sunni tradition has understood it, and we'll see what that is like now. Jihad is a term from Arabic that does mean struggle or resisting. Striving in the way of God is what it means. And within the context of classical Islamic law, it refers to a struggle against those who do not believe in the God of Islam, Allah. This is an important aspect of Shiite tradition and Shiite beliefs. The concept of jihad in Shiite tradition also includes armed struggle against anybody who is doing what is wrong. And that will incorporate those who do not believe in the God of Islam, in the God Allah. Armed struggle becomes a central concept in this aspect of jihad in Shiite tradition. Now, the Sunnis have given this a much wider definition. Many observers, both Muslim and non-Muslim, show that jihad actually has 2 meanings. The most important one, particularly from the Sunni perspective, is that jihad is an inner struggle, the greater jihad. It's this understanding that as a human being, as a follower of the teachings of Muhammad, you have this ability to read and understand the Quran. You have this example from the Hadiths and the other writings of all of these prominent imams through history about how you're supposed to live. Well, we know that. We know how we're supposed to live. We know what's good. We know what's bad. We know right from wrong. Do we always do what is right? And this is the inner struggle. This is the struggle that the tradition looks at and calls the greater jihad. The struggle we have as individuals to try to live our lives in a way that is godly. And we know we don't always live up to that, but we struggle and we strive and we try to be better. The Shiites take this to another aspect, which is the outer physical struggle against the enemies of Islam, and this is always called the lesser jihad. The important thing in the tradition was the inner struggle spiritually for your own life. The lesser side of it was struggling against the enemies of Islam. Now, the Shia teach that jihad can only be carried out under the leadership of the Imam, who will return from the occultation to bring absolute justice to the world. Traditionally, the understanding is the only time that jihad can be carried out is when this 12th Imam finally does return as the messianic leader. This all began to change several years ago when the civil war broke out in the nation of Syria. With the outbreak of civil war in Syria, we have a problem, because the ruling power in Syria is with a little known group It's the Alawite Christians. We'll take a look at them in the future. They have some very particular beliefs that are very much mix of many different religious traditions, but primarily within the Christian faith. They became the ruling power, and they began to use their power to oppress the population of the nation. And as Syria breaks out into civil war, the Shiites begin to side with the population. For the first time in history of Shiite Islam, adherents are now going into another country to fight a holy war in order to defend their doctrine. They're going into Syria, and of course, in the midst of all of this, this began to spread even more widely across the Middle East in recent years. Adherents of the Shiite tradition going into another country to fight jihad. Even though the 12th Imam has not returned from the occultation, they are still going and fighting anyway against their belief that this is something you cannot do. The Shiites also add a third element to the profession of faith in the call to prayer. A good Shiite will profess that there is no God but God. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. And they add a third element, Ali is the deputy of God. This becomes a part of their basic understanding of what they are to do. Shia expresses a great veneration for, and the prominent narratives surrounding Ali, Fatima, who's the daughter of Muhammad. All of the imams, all of these people become very prominent aspects of the faith and the tradition, and they become people that they worship and adore and celebrate their lives, the veneration of these saints of the tradition, as we could call them. These people, the Ali, Fatima, the Imams, all of the other leaders, are people who become the role models for how you are supposed to live your life. And the Shia invoke these models for the tradition. They recall the moral qualities and the events in the lives of these figures, and they celebrate them on a regular basis. Women look to Fatima as the ideal woman, how they are supposed to live their life according to the way that she lives. And she becomes the model for how young girls are to grow up and become women in the society. The men take Ali and Hussein as their ideal. And they become the models of faith. Now, what happens in the tradition here, as a part of the belief, is specific celebrations are connected with the birth and death of these imams and other important figures. Fatima and Hussein, for example, are celebrated all of the time. What we find in these traditions, which is separate from the Sunni tradition, is many times these important figures have special holy sites that are built that people will make pilgrimages to in order to celebrate that person's life. A small number of celebrations are also dedicated to other memorial events in early Islamic history. For example, there is a special celebration, a worship and community gathering to remember the time when the 12th Imam went away into this occultation, this place that's somewhere else, and waiting in expectation for this person to return in order to set up the world of justice. Well, these are some of the practices and some of the traditions and beliefs of the Shia community. They continue to have a profound impact in our world, and we have seen a lot of this recently through the history of Iran and Iraq, Syria, Turkey, all of this being influenced by the civil wars and the wars that have been fought since the time of the original 1979 overthrow of the Shah of Iran and the beginning of the Islamic Revolution. These have played a significant role in our world today, and they will continue to do so going forward in the future. So we're going to stop there for today. We're going to pick up again next week in looking at another aspect, another change that has taken place in the Islamic tradition, and it happened here in the United States. It begins as a movement of attracting people into the practice of Islam, and then begins to shift and change into what we now know as the Nation of Islam. Next week, when we get together, we'll be looking at that particular tradition. So thank you again. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture today, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you again next week. Take care.